Hello there, dear friend. Come sit with me a while, maybe with a cup of something warm, and let's rest a bit among the pots and petals. The morning sun is stretching slowly across the porch, soft bird song humming in the background, and the gentle scent of damp earth rising with each breath of breeze. It's one of those quiet gardening mornings where time slows down and memories seem to grow alongside the plants. I've been container gardening for over 35 years now. Not in some grand estate with endless space, but on a humble little patio, I've coaxed into something beautiful through trial error and a whole lot of love. And truth be told, it wasn't the successes that taught me the most. It was the mistakes. The plants that looked perfect in the nursery, but became heartbreaks in pots. The ones that cost too much, took too much, or left behind more mess than magic. That's what I want to share with you today, not to discourage you, but to gently guide your hands away from the trouble I've already walked through. These are flowers I deeply regret planting in containers. Not because they're bad plants in every setting, but because in a small garden like mine, and perhaps like yours, they demanded more than they gave. You don't need money or youth to have a lovely garden. What you need is care, imagination, and a willingness to learn from those who've weathered the seasons. So I'll tell you everything, what went wrong, why it happened, and what I'd plant instead. Not as a lecture, but like a neighbor leaning over the fence saying, "Don't make my mistake, friend." Let's begin with a flower that looked like a dream until it started swallowing everything in its path. Remember those old seed catalogs with dreamy pictures of vines dripping in purple-blue trumpets? That's what first pulled me in. Morning glories looked like something from a fairy tale, delicate, magical, and full of charm. I imagined them wrapping gently around my trellis, providing a soft curtain of color for my little patio. So I bought 3 seedlings and nestled them into my favorite tall containers full of hope. But here's what no one warned me. Morning glories don't whisper, they roar. They belong to the Ipomoea family, which includes wild sweet potatoes, and their growing habit is aggressive beyond reason. In a matter of weeks, those tiny vines had turned into a jungle. They climbed everything, not just their own cages, but my patio chairs, the table legs, the handrails, even the garden hose. I once caught them snaking up the outdoor light fixture. 3 inches of growth per day. That's not poetic exaggeration, that's what I measured during peak season. It wasn't long before they tangled themselves tightly around my petunias and basil, choking the life right out of them. Trying to unwind those vines was like trying to undo a tangled necklace with your eyes closed. They clung so fiercely I had to sacrifice entire plants just to remove them. And the roots. Oh friend, the roots. Morning glories form deep tap roots that shoot down fast. Mine had poked through the drainage holes and rooted into the concrete cracks beneath my containers. Even after I pulled up everything I could see, they kept coming back. Little shoots would pop up in new places weeks later, like ghosts from last season. I learned the hard way that morning glory seeds can remain dormant in the soil for decades, up to 50 years, waiting for the right moment to grow again. It felt like I'd invited in a guest who took over the whole house and refused to leave. I share this not to scare you, but to help you choose better. If you're looking for a trailing vine in a container, consider sweet potato vine, lush, fast-growing, but without the smothering instinct. Or try bacopa with its soft, cascading blooms that stay polite and in their place. Morning glories taught me a powerful lesson. Just because something begins beautifully doesn't mean it belongs. Some things are better admired from a distance or kept firmly in the ground. After the first season, I thought I'd seen the worst of morning glory's behavior. The vines were gone. The containers scrubbed clean, and I was ready to move on. But nature had other plans. You see, with morning glories, the trouble doesn't end above ground. It continues below in the quiet, determined darkness of the soil. Their root system is what gardeners call a taproot, a strong central root that drives deep like a stake, surrounded by fine lateral roots that spread wide. In the open ground, this helps them survive droughts. In containers, it becomes a prison escape artist. My morning glories didn't just root deeply, they reached through the drainage holes of my planters and into the patio bricks underneath. I remember tipping over one of the containers to clean it out, only to find long roots threading through the crack between the concrete slabs. Some had even split and traveled several feet like they were scouting for new territory. When I tried to lift the container, I realized it was tethered to the earth. But the real surprise came the following spring. I hadn't planted any more, and yet tiny green shoots began to sprout in all corners of the patio, in containers between pavers, even in a forgotten corner behind the grill. I dug and dug trying to find where they came from. That's when I learned about root regeneration. Morning glories can sprout new vines from root fragments as small as 2 inches. 2 inches. Every time I pulled up a vine the previous year, I may have accidentally created a dozen more. Then came the seed discovery. One afternoon, I ran my fingers through the soil and felt something hard and round, seeds. Dozens of them. Even after removing the plants, the seeds had remained hidden like buried treasure. Morning glory seeds have a hard seed coat like nature's armor, allowing them to stay viable in the soil for decades, sometimes up to 50 years. They can withstand frost, drought, and even mild soil disturbance. The next time you dig in that area, the act of stirring the soil can be enough to wake them. They are in every way a long-term guest you didn't plan to house. These plants may be beautiful, but in containers they're better suited to be admired, not planted. Unless you want to spend the next 5 summers battling vines you didn't invite, give your pots to gentler souls. Gardening has taught me this: not everything that grows well is a good fit for your space. And sometimes it's not about what the eye sees, it's about what the roots are quietly doing beneath your feet. Do you remember those flower beds in front of old churches or town halls, just bursting with color, packed tight with blooms that seemed to never take a day off? That's how I fell in love with impatiens. They felt nostalgic and reliable, shade-loving, endlessly blooming and cheerful in a way that made my patio look like a little party every morning. So for years I planted them, and I do mean years. But slowly I started noticing a pattern. My water bills would spike every summer. The impatiens were always the first to wilt if I missed even one watering. And more than once I came home from errands to find them collapsed in their pots like they were fainting in protest. You see, impatiens have delicate, juicy stems and thin leaves that lose moisture quickly. Their roots are shallow, so in containers they have no reserve, no cushion to ride out a hot afternoon. During peak summer heat, I was watering them twice a day, morning and evening. It became a ritual I dreaded. I'd set my alarm early just to keep up, but if I ever left town or forgot a single session, they punished me. One summer I sat down and did the math. The increase in my water bill came to over $200, and I realized nearly half of that was for these low-maintenance little darlings. And then came the mildew. Impatient plants, constantly wet and crowded in containers, created the perfect home for downy mildew, a silent disease that shows up like a thief in the night. One day the plants looked fine. The next, their leaves were soft browning and soggy. Within a week, 12 containers worth of impatiens turned to mush. The soil was infected. The spores clung to the pots, to the watering can, even to my shoes. Downy mildew can linger in soil for up to 3 years, waiting patiently for new impatiens to arrive like unsuspecting guests. I had to throw everything out, $150 worth of potting soil gone. I learned that impatiens evolved in the tropical forest understory, where they get gentle rainfall and mist daily. But a patio in the Midwest with hard sun and dry wind, that's not their world. If you love that soft, full look, consider New Guinea impatiens instead. They've got thicker stems and are far more resilient. Or go with begonias, especially waxleaf varieties. They hold moisture, better resist disease, and need far less fuss. Looking back, I don't blame the impatiens. They were doing exactly what they were designed to do. But I was asking them to bloom in a world that wasn't theirs and paying dearly for it. Sometimes love isn't enough, especially when it comes with a hose in one hand and a water bill in the other. I wish I could tell you I saw it coming, that there was some sign, some soft whisper from the garden letting me know trouble was brewing. But no, the impatiens looked healthy one day, and by the next they were folding in on themselves like wet paper. At first I thought I had overwatered, then maybe underwatered. But when I leaned closer, the truth was unmistakable: soft brown spots on the undersides of leaves, a fuzz like dust clinging to the stems, and a smell not of earth, but of something sour and sad. Downy mildew had arrived. Now, if you're not familiar with this disease, let me gently warn you, it is one of the most stubborn, unforgiving invaders a container gardener can face. Caused by a microscopic pathogen, Plasmopara, Obducen's downy mildew spreads like wildfire in the very conditions impatiens prefer: moist soil shade and cozy proximity to other plants. And container gardens. They're the perfect storm. My tightly grouped containers full of moisture-loving flowers created little humidity traps where airflow was poor and leaves stayed damp long after the watering was done. That's all it took. One infected plant, maybe from a nursery, maybe from wind-blown spores, and by the end of the week, 12 full containers were soggy, wilted, and beyond saving. I cried, and I'm not ashamed to admit it, because the worst part wasn't just the loss of the flowers. It was the contamination of the soil. Downy mildew spores don't simply vanish when you toss a plant. They embed in the soil waiting. Some produce oospores, thick-walled survival spores that endure winter freezes and can lie dormant for years. I had to dump every bit of soil, almost $150 worth of premium mix, and scrub every container with bleach. Even then I worried. Would the mildew return? Would it spread to my other containers? I felt like I was starting over from scratch. It was then I discovered the beauty of New Guinea impatiens hybrids, with thicker, more drought-tolerant stems and genetic resistance to downy mildew. I also learned to space my containers better, prune for airflow and water from below, never splashing the leaves. It's humbling to realize how small things, droplet spacing, shade, can make the difference between a thriving garden and one wiped out in days. Downy mildew taught me that prevention is peace. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for your future self is to let go of what keeps coming back to hurt you. If you've ever loved impatiens and lost them, I see you. And I promise better flowers and easier days are ahead. There was a summer I fell in love with zinnias. You know, the ones, those joyful candy-colored blooms that seem to glow even in the heat. I planted them in wide, shallow containers near the sunny side of my patio, imagining months of cheerful color with almost no effort. That's what the seed packets promised: heat-tolerant, low-maintenance, perfect for beginners. For a few weeks they delivered. Bold pinks, buttery yellows, fiery reds. Bees came, butterflies danced. I felt like I had finally found a plant that loved me back. And then by July something changed. At first it looked like dust, a soft white powder on a few leaves. I brushed it off with my thumb. But by the next week it was everywhere. The leaves were coated. The stems were dull and grayish. The blooms started looking thin and eventually stopped forming altogether. My zinnias had been overtaken by powdery mildew, and what was once vibrant became ghostly. Powdery mildew is caused by a fungus, Erysiphus cicoracearum, and it thrives in the exact microclimate that container gardens often create: warm days, cool nights, and tight plant spacing that traps humidity. Most fungal diseases need freestanding water to spread, but not this one. Powdery mildew only needs moisture in the air, not on the leaves. My containers, packed full for that lush look, had no room for air to flow. And as night temperatures dipped, condensation formed between leaves and stems like a greenhouse in miniature. I tried everything: milk sprays, baking soda, neem oil. I even wiped leaves by hand. But once powdery mildew sets in, it's nearly impossible to erase. The spores drifted from one pot to the next. Marigolds, daisies, even my herbs. And here's the part that broke my heart: even after removing the zinnias, the fungal spores lingered. Powdery mildew forms little structures called chasmothecia, protective vessels that overwinter and burst open in the next season, starting the cycle all over again. I spent more than $80 on organic treatments, countless hours trying to stop the spread, and yet half my zinnias never recovered. They limped along until the first frost, a pale reminder of their former selves. But I've learned since then that the fault wasn't all theirs. It was mine for believing the label instead of learning the plant. Zinnias evolved in the open plains of Mexico, hot, dry, breezy, not humid enclosed patios. If you love zinnias, look for disease-resistant series like the Profusion line, and give them space. 6 to 8 inches between plants, even if it looks sparse at first. Sometimes in gardening, as in life, the things that start out easy don't stay that way. And when beauty fades under pressure, it's not always weakness. Sometimes it's just being in the wrong environment. If I could go back and change one thing in those early years of container gardening, it wouldn't be the soil or even the plant choices, it would be how I arranged them. Because what I didn't know then was that beauty without breathing room comes at a price. When I set up my patio each spring, I used to tuck the containers close together edge to edge, creating that lush, overflowing look that felt like an English cottage garden. It was cozy, colorful, and full. And, unknowingly, it was the perfect recipe for disaster. You see, in the open ground, air moves freely between plants. Wind passes through. Moisture evaporates. But on a small patio, especially when containers are pressed side by side, air stagnates. That still, humid layer around the leaves becomes a breeding ground for fungal diseases, just like the powdery mildew that overtook my zinnias, or the downy mildew that rotted my impatiens. I didn't understand this at first. I thought mildew came from bad plants or bad weather. But the truth is it came from bad airflow. Here's how it works. When temperatures swing between warm days and cool nights, which is common in late spring and early fall, moisture from the air condenses on plant surfaces. If there's no breeze to dry it out, it just sits there invisible to the eye, but dangerous all the same. Fungal spores only need a few hours of this to germinate and spread. And in containers, it happens faster than you think. I once measured the space between two of my pots, just 2 inches. That tiny gap held enough trapped humidity to infect both plants within days. I also learned that tight spacing doesn't just encourage disease, it exhausts your plants. They compete for light for air for every breath of space. Leaves rub against each other, spreading spores and blocking sunshine. Some stems begin to yellow at the base, collapsing from stress, even if the soil is perfect. It's not about how many plants you can fit in a space, it's about how well they can breathe once they're there. Now I follow a simple rule. Less is more. I leave 6 to 8 inches between flowering plants even in larger pots. I stagger heights to let the air move freely, and I rotate containers once a week to make sure no side is always in shadow. It may not look as full in the first month, but by midsummer the plants reward me with health, vigor, and longer-lasting blooms. There's a quiet metaphor in that, I think. Like us, plants need space to stretch, to breathe, to exist without being smothered. A crowded garden may look alive, but one with airflow thrives. Have you ever looked at a packet of sunflower seeds and imagined a golden jungle right outside your door? That's exactly what I did. The picture showed towering stalks, smiling faces turned toward the sky, promising shade, beauty, and even seeds for the birds. I thought, wouldn't that be a lovely statement on the patio, a little touch of farm life right in my suburban container garden? So I chose a variety labeled Mammoth, and that name should have been my first clue. I planted them in large tubs, 10-gallon containers, thinking that was more than enough. At first, everything looked perfect. The stalks grew straight and fast, the leaves broad and green. I even caught a goldfinch hopping nearby, inspecting the progress. But then came the wind. What I hadn't considered was physics. A full-grown sunflower head can be 10 inches wide and weigh up to 4 pounds once the seeds fill in, especially after a rain. Add in a 7-foot stalk with leaves acting like little sails, and what you've got is a top-heavy tower in a lightweight container. It only took one afternoon thunderstorm to topple the first one. The pot cracked. Soil spilled out across the flagstone, and the beautiful stalk bent right in half, snapping under the weight. That was just the beginning. Each breeze that summer became a threat. I started tying them to stakes, then tying the stakes to nearby furniture. I bought guy wires like I was rigging a sailboat, trying to keep them upright. My patio began to look like a construction zone. It turns out to grow full-size sunflowers in containers, you really need 20-gallon pots minimum. And even then, you're fighting the wind gravity and the sunflower's natural tendency to heliotropically track the sun, shifting slightly each day. That motion actually weakens the stem over time. And the birds, they came all right. But not in quiet appreciation. Squirrels leapt onto the stalks, nibbling at half-formed seed heads. Whole flocks of birds descended, pecking, jostling, and scattering petals. My patio table, my chair cushions, even my other containers all got showered in bird droppings. I tried netting, but that only caused more issues. Birds got tangled. I got tangled. The wind twisted the mesh around my tomato cages and snapped a neighboring plant in the process. Eventually, I gave up. I had traded peace for drama, beauty for chaos. But the dream wasn't wrong, just the scale. Now I grow dwarf varieties like teddy bear or music box. They stay under 3 feet tall, offer adorable blooms, and still make the birds happy without the engineering headache. There's something to be said for knowing your space. Not everything needs to be tall to be beautiful. Sometimes a little sunlight at eye level is more than enough. At first, it felt magical. I'd sit on my patio with my morning tea, and a little goldfinch would perch on one of the sunflower stalks, tilting its head, pecking gently at a forming seed. It was the kind of scene you see in greeting cards, peace, nature, harmony. But by the end of the month, that one finch had brought friends. Lots of them. What began as a quiet joy turned into a full-blown bird storm. I hadn't realized just how irresistible sunflower seeds are to wildlife, not just finches and sparrows, but jays, doves, and even squirrels. A single mature sunflower head can contain 1,000 to 2,000 seeds rich in oils and protein. That's like laying out a buffet on your patio. Soon I couldn't leave my coffee cup unattended. Flocks would descend without warning, their wings flapping, feathers flying, and sunflower petals raining down like confetti. The stalks swayed under the weight, some bending awkwardly as birds scrambled for perches. And then came the mess. Droppings on the patio tiles, the furniture, the container rims, it became a daily cleaning chore. My once serene garden spot now smelled like the back corner of a city park. I tried to fix it. I bought bird netting thinking I could protect the seeds without hurting anyone. But that netting became its own problem. On windy days, it blew loose and tangled in the stems. Worse, I found 2 small birds trapped in it, one injured, another terrified. I'll never forget gently freeing a little cardinal whose wing had become twisted in the mesh. I had to call a local wildlife rescue group, and the guilt of that moment still lingers. The squirrels weren't deterred either. They'd climb anything: tomato cages, chair backs, even my wind chimes, just to gnaw into the seed heads. And once they found them, they didn't stop there. They dug into my other pots, searching for hidden snacks. My herbs were uprooted, my marigolds shredded, my sanity hanging by a thread. Sunflowers brought more than I bargained for. Not just in beauty, but in attention, and with it chaos. I learned that on a small patio, you can't invite nature without setting boundaries. These days, I still grow sunflowers, but I've switched to dwarf varieties with smaller seed heads, less tempting to large birds. And I plant them farther from the seeding area where wildlife can enjoy them without taking over. It's lovely to share your garden with birds. It really is. But there's a difference between welcoming visitors and accidentally hosting the neighborhood wildlife convention. Sometimes restraint is the kindest gift for them and for yourself. It started so innocently, a small pot of chocolate mint nestled among my other herbs near the kitchen door. I rubbed the leaves gently between my fingers, releasing that cool, sweet scent, and thought, this will be lovely in tea. And it was for about a month. Mint, especially chocolate mint, is one of those plants that seduces you with charm, then quietly takes over your life. In the beginning, it behaved, or at least pretended to. But while I was marveling at its fragrance and soft lavender blooms, it was already plotting its escape. What most garden tags don't mention is that mint doesn't grow in neat little clumps. It spreads underground using rhizomes, horizontal stems that creep through soil, searching for new space to colonize. In the ground, this isn't a big surprise, but in containers, I thought I was safe. I was not. By midsummer, I noticed mint sprouting in containers I hadn't planted it in. It had slipped through the drainage holes, squeezed into the cracks between bricks, and even popped up in my indoor fern pot, a plant I'd only set outside for some fresh air. I had unintentionally unleashed a fragrant fugitive. Within a season, mint had established itself beneath my patio. I found shoots growing between pavers, through seams in the concrete, and under my garden bench. It's not just the spread, it's the way mint dominates. Its roots are strong, dense, and determined, and it doesn't play well with others. Mint releases allelopathic chemicals, natural substances that inhibit the growth of surrounding plants. I noticed my thyme and oregano struggling, and only later realized it wasn't coincidence. The mint was choking them out underground and unseen. I tried digging it up. I tried cutting it back. I even tried planting mint inside another container, a pot inside a pot, thinking that double walls would block the runners. It still found a way. 3 years later, I'm still finding mint sprouts in places I never expected. And just last spring, I found a sprig growing from the rain gutter above my patio. I wish I were joking. That's when I learned that mint's rhizomes can travel up to 4 feet from the parent plant, and they can lie dormant waiting. All it takes is one tiny fragment, even an inch long, to start a whole new plant. And yes, they can hitch a ride on shoes, tools, or even the wind. If you love mint, and I still do grow it indoors in a pot with solid walls and no drainage holes touching the ground, or grow it in a sealed plastic container outdoors up on a table, or stand far from other plants. Mint is like a charming house guest who overstays their welcome and rearranges your furniture while you're sleeping. Beautiful, but best kept under lock and key. Once I realized what mint had done to my containers, I thought the worst was behind me. But then I discovered that the real damage wasn't what I could see above the soil, it was the silent warfare happening beneath. You see, mint isn't just a fast grower. It's a strategic invader armed with a root system designed to conquer. Those creeping rhizomes I mentioned earlier, they don't just spread out gently, they bully everything in their path. At first, I thought my other plants were just having a rough season. The lemon balm wasn't as bright. My dill kept turning yellow and stalling mid-growth. Even my basil, usually a patio superstar, looked tired and limp. But the mint was thriving, growing taller, leafier, and more confident by the day. That's when I learned about allelopathy, a survival strategy, where one plant releases chemical compounds into the soil that inhibit or kill neighboring plants. It's nature's version of sabotage. Mint does this quietly, excreting substances from its roots that interfere with nearby plants' nutrient uptake and root development. In small, enclosed containers, this behavior turns mint into a monarch, ruling the soil-draining resources and leaving nothing behind for its neighbors. It's not a plant that shares well. The strangest part: the soil itself began to change. The structure became dense and compacted, as if the mint's root web had squeezed all the air out. When I finally dumped one of the affected pots, I found a solid mat of roots, not just from the mint, but also from plants that had been forced to grow sideways in shallow searching desperately for space the mint had already claimed. I tried installing root barriers, plastic shields meant to keep the mint contained. But unless they extended 18 inches deep and 2 inches above the soil line, they failed. The mint would just send a runner over the top or sneak beneath the barrier like a vine with a mission. The worst part, I began to find mint sprouts in containers on the opposite side of the patio. It had spread underground, weaving its way through unseen soil connections, or even traveling through gaps in my stone flooring. It was like a quiet invasion. No trumpet sound, no warning, just a slow takeover. And yet, it still smelled so good. That's the tricky thing with mint. It fools you. It's pleasant, nostalgic, useful in tea and baking, and even good for pollinators. But in containers, especially on patios with limited space, it becomes the root of chaos. Now I've quarantined all mint to standalone pots with solid bottoms placed up high on metal plant stands like little towers in exile. It was hard to do, but I've learned something important from this root war. In a small garden, you have to choose your companions wisely. Not every pretty thing deserves a place beside your peace. Some plants are meant to grow alone where they can't hurt what you've worked so hard to build. There's no flower quite like a dahlia. The first time I saw one up close, a dinner plate variety with layer upon layer of deep pink petals, I gasped. It looked like something hand-carved from silk, too perfect to be real. That summer, I walked out of a garden show carrying a bag of tubers, my heart full of excitement and my mind dancing with color combinations. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't just buying flowers. I was entering into a relationship, one that would ask more of me than I ever imagined. Dahlias aren't like other container flowers. They're divas in the most glamorous and demanding sense of the word. To start, the tubers aren't cheap. Premium varieties can run between $15 and $30 each. And with containers, you're often planting more than one per pot to get that lush, full look. Before I knew it, I'd spent over $300 on just the tubers, imagining a summer patio that would rival a floral runway. And for a while it did. The blooms came enormous, show-stopping, worthy of every photo I took. But behind the beauty was a to-do list that never seemed to end. Dahlias need staking from the moment they're knee-high, and not just bamboo sticks and a twist tie. I mean 6-foot rebar driven deep into the soil with soft ties adjusted weekly as the plant climbs. Without this support, one rainstorm or gust of wind can topple the entire plant. And then there's the watering, the fertilizing, the constant deadheading to keep them blooming. Each spent bloom must be removed carefully too low, and you risk cutting a new bud too high and the stem stays bare. But the real heartbreak came in the fall, because dahlias aren't hardy in most container situations. Once frost threatens, you have to dig up every tuber, clean off the soil, let them cure for 2 weeks, and then store them in perfect conditions. Between 40–50 degree. Humidity between 50–60%. Surrounded by slightly damp vermiculite or peat moss, and checked monthly for rot or shriveling. That first winter I tried storing them in my garage. It was too warm. They sprouted early and spent their energy before spring. The next year my basement was too dry. They shriveled up. In total I lost 60% of my tubers in just 2 seasons. It felt like keeping a box of antique china, precious, delicate, and a little exhausting. Now I still admire dahlias, but from afar. For my own containers, I've switched to large flowered begonias and hardy hibiscus plants that deliver drama without the high demands. Dahlias taught me that beauty doesn't always equal peace. And sometimes in the garden and in life, it's okay to admire something deeply without choosing to carry the weight of it every season. There's a certain kind of quiet before a summer storm. Heavy air, slow rustling leaves, that faint metallic scent of rain just beyond the horizon. I remember standing on my patio during one of those moments, admiring my dahlia containers, proud of their towering blooms and upright stalks. They looked invincible, but I should have known better. The storm that rolled in that evening didn't seem particularly violent at first. A little thunder, a few gusts of wind, then a downpour, the kind that makes you glad you got your gardening done early. I watched from the window with a warm cup of tea, thinking everything would be fine. It wasn't. The next morning I stepped outside and found devastation. One of my largest ceramic containers had tipped over, completely shattered into 3 jagged pieces. The soil lay in a muddy heap, the tuber exposed, snapped from the stalk. 2 other containers had been pulled sideways, their bamboo stakes bent like reeds. And several of my prized dahlias, the ones I had babied for months, were snapped clean at the base. The storm hadn't been extreme. But with dahlias, especially in containers, it doesn't take much. You see, dahlias grow tall, often over 3 to 5 feet, depending on the variety. Their flower heads can measure 10 to 12 inches across, and when wet, they hold water like a sponge. Each bloom can weigh over a pound after a rain. Multiply that by several flowers on one stalk, and you've got a top-heavy plant dancing on a balance beam. In the ground, they at least have the support of deep roots and surrounding soil. But in containers, they're always one strong gust away from disaster. I had staked them. I thought I'd done everything right. But I'd forgotten one key detail: the containers themselves need anchoring. That year I learned that even the best staking means little if the container can't withstand the weight shift. You need wide, heavy-bottom pots sometimes with added weights or bricks in the base to prevent tipping. And yet, there's only so much you can fight physics. I stood out there that morning in my slippers, holding broken stems in my hands like wilted trophies, heart-sinking. These were the blooms I had waited for all summer, the colors I dreamed of in February. All gone in a single night. That's when I realized something deeper. I had overinvested in something that offered little stability. Not just in money or time, but in emotion. I had wrapped so much hope into those flowers that I'd forgotten to account for how fragile they truly were. Now I still grow tall flowers, but with more caution, more balance. I use dwarf varieties, I add natural windbreaks, and I space things more generously. But more than anything, I've learned that not every bloom is meant for every space. Some flowers, like some dreams, need more support than a small container or a tired gardener can give. Word count 5 for 3. Every gardener has a season where they want to take it easy. A season where life gets busy, the knees ache a little more, and simplicity sounds sweeter than ever. That's the summer I planted Nasturtiums. I had read all the headlines: perfect for beginners, thrives in poor soil, edible and beautiful. It felt like a no-brainer. The seeds were cheap, the colors were cheerful, and I imagined their trailing vines spilling softly over my containers like streams of golden lace. And for a little while they were exactly that. But within a month I started noticing something strange. My herbs, healthy just the week before, were suddenly covered in aphids. Tiny green clusters huddled under leaves, sap-sucking their way through my dill parsley and even my peppers. I inspected the Nasturtiums and, to my horror, found them absolutely infested. Their round lily-pad leaves were teeming with aphids so dense they looked like moss. Some stems were black with clusters, At first, I thought the Nasturtiums had been victims of the infestation, but the truth was far more surprising. Nasturtiums produce high levels of glucosinolate compounds, a type of mustard oil that aphids absolutely adore. In large gardens, this makes them ideal trap crops, plants meant to attract pests away from vegetables. But on a compact patio where every container is within a few feet of the next, that trap became a launch pad. Aphids reproduce asexually. One can become 50 in a week and hundreds in a month. And when a colony gets crowded, they grow wings, literally transforming into a migratory phase that travels to nearby plants. Soon, my once thriving patio was under siege. I tried everything: soapy water, neem oil, insecticidal sprays, even releasing ladybugs in hopes they'd stay. But nothing kept up with the sheer pace of reproduction. Every time I thought I had the upper hand, a new generation had already taken over. And then came the sooty mold, a black fungus that feeds on the sticky honeydew aphids leave behind. It coated leaves, darkened the soil, and made everything feel grimy. Even after removing the nasturtiums, the mold remained thriving in the sugar-rich residue and tainting the once healthy potting mix. I ended up replacing the soil in half my containers. The aphids had already laid eggs. The mold spores had already settled in. The $5 packet of nasturtium seeds had led to over $150 in damage, not to mention weeks of frustration. Looking back, it wasn't the plant's fault. Nasturtiums can be useful, but only when isolated, planted well away from your main displays. 50 feet away, experts recommend if you're using them as a decoy. That's a luxury container gardeners simply don't have. Now I admire nasturtiums from afar, in someone else's raised bed maybe. Because while they're beautiful, easy, and edible, they come with a secret weapon that once unleashed in close quarters is nearly impossible to control. Sometimes even the gentlest looking things can harbor hidden chaos. When gardeners talk about pests, most of us think of chewed leaves or the occasional bug crawling across a stem. But what I experienced after planting nasturtiums went far beyond that. It wasn't just a pest problem. It was a slow, creeping ecological collapse in my tiny garden. The aphids had already spread from the nasturtiums to nearly every other container. My herbs were riddled with pinprick wounds. The tops of my peppers curled in on themselves like drying paper. Even my marigolds, usually the tough soldiers of my patio, looked pale and wilted. I kept spraying, kept trimming back the worst damage, kept whispering to the plants, "Hold on just a little longer." But it was already too late, because the aphids didn't come alone. They brought with them a partner, sooty mold. This thick black fungus doesn't feed on the plant itself, but on the sticky honeydew that aphids excrete as they feed. The honeydew coats leaves, stems, and eventually the soil surface. And once the mold takes hold, it turns everything it touches into a greasy, charcoal-colored mess. At first, I tried wiping the leaves by hand. Then I rinsed them gently with the hose. But in containers where the airflow is already limited, wetting the leaves only made it worse. The fungus thrives in still, moist environments, and my careful efforts were feeding it instead of fighting it. I removed the nasturtiums, hoping the outbreak would slow, but by then the mold had soaked into the potting mix, forming a thick film across the soil surface, blocking water from reaching the roots and releasing spores every time I disturbed the soil. Even worse, the stressed plants were now attracting other problems: spider mites, leaf miners, even fungus gnats. It felt like everything I had built carefully, lovingly over years was unraveling. I spent hours researching remedies, treatments, and soil rescue techniques. But in the end, I had to do the hardest thing: start over. I emptied the worst containers, hauled the soil into heavy-duty trash bags, bleached the pots, let them sun-dry for a full day. It took me nearly 2 weeks to recover the space and over $150 in replacement soil, new plants, and organic pest control products, all from one packet of nasturtium seeds. The irony is bitter. A flower that's supposed to be low-maintenance, beginner-friendly, and helpful in pest control had cost me more time, effort, and money than any plant that season. That's when I finally understood context is everything. In a big garden, nasturtiums have room to draw aphids away from vegetables. But in tight container gardens, they don't serve as a shield, they serve as a spark. Now, if I ever use nasturtiums again, I plant them far away from my main containers and I treat them as sacrificial. But more often than not, I simply pass them by. There's a lesson here, I think, about beauty intention and knowing your space. Because sometimes a flower doesn't fail you. It just doesn't belong in your world. If there's one flower that fools almost every gardener, beginner, or seasoned, it's the petunia. They start out like little miracles. You bring them home from the nursery in hanging baskets or small pots, and they're full spilling over the edges with that lush, vibrant charm. Reds, purples, whites, even velvety blacks. They bloom with enthusiasm, with no pests, no fuss, and no sign of what's to come. For the first few weeks, I felt like I'd struck gold. My patio looked like it belonged in a magazine. Visitors complimented the displays, and I caught myself smiling every time I stepped outside. But then came July. Almost overnight, those same petunias started to change. The flowers slowed. The foliage stretched. Long, leggy vines emerged with blooms only at the very ends, like they were reaching for something they'd never quite touch. What had once been full and round now looked sparse and tired. I tried everything. I deadheaded, cutting back spent blooms to encourage new ones. I fertilized. I even cut the plants back by half, hoping to reset their growth. But the results were disappointing. They'd bush up a bit only to stretch again days later. I didn't understand what I was doing wrong until I learned about the petunia's natural programming. Petunias are native to temperate regions of South America, where they grow as short-lived perennials with a single mission bloom, quickly then conserve energy. They exhibit apical dominance, meaning the topmost growing tip suppresses side growth. So unless you're constantly pinching them back, they grow into long, stringy stems with a few tired flowers at the tips. And it's not just genetics, it's climate. Petunias need cool night temperatures, ideally between 60–65 degrees Celsius, to grow compact and vibrant. But where I live, summer nights are warm and humid, and petunias don't cope well. Once nights stay hot, they stretch. It's what they're wired to do. Then there's the stickiness. Oh, the stickiness. Petunia stems and leaves are covered in glandular trichomes, tiny hairs that secrete a thick resin-like substance. Every time I deadheaded them, my fingers would come away coated in a gluey film. Soap barely removed it. Some days it even irritated my skin. I started wearing gloves, but even that felt like too much effort for a plant that was already disappointing me. Rain. It turned the petals to mush. Wind. It shredded them. Even morning dew caused the blooms to collapse like wet tissue. By midsummer, the containers looked like forgotten leftovers. The truth was, simple petunias were never built to last through the full container season, not without heavy maintenance and constant intervention. I needed something gentler. Something that gave beauty without the burden. Now instead of petunias, I plant calabrachoa, also called million bells. They're related to petunias, but bred for heat tolerance, compact growth, and long-lasting blooms. I also use bacopa, especially in the heat of late summer. It thrives when petunias give up, and its small flowers cascade just as sweetly. Petunias taught me something hard but important. Not every plant that starts strong is built to endure. And sometimes you need a flower that doesn't need saving, one that meets you where you are and keeps blooming through the heat. There's a saying I once heard, you can't outgarden your climate. And nowhere did I learn that lesson more deeply than with petunias. As their midsummer decline continued year after year, I kept blaming myself. Maybe I wasn't pruning enough. Maybe my fertilizer ratio was off. Maybe I missed a pest, a watering, a magic trick the pros knew. But the real reason it wasn't me. It was biology and weather. Petunias are genetically designed for short, cool growing seasons. In their native South American habitats, they thrive during brief, temperate stretches. They're built for a strong, early bloom, then a period of rest. But here in much of the U.S., we ask them to bloom continuously from May to October under conditions they were never meant to endure. When night temperatures rise and stay warm, especially above 70-degree petunias begin to stretch no matter how well you care for them. Their internal growth clock tells them to conserve, not flourish. No amount of deadheading or miracle products can change their DNA. Humidity makes things worse. In muggy conditions, petals stick together, turn brown, or simply rot before they open fully. And on breezy days, their delicate blossoms tear like wet tissue, leaving behind ragged ends and disheartened stems. One year I tried planting only double-flowered petunias, the ruffled kind, like tissue pom-poms. I thought they'd be more showy, longer lasting, but they were even more fragile. Rain turned their blossoms into soggy clumps, and they never recovered after a summer storm. And then there was the daily maintenance. To keep them looking halfway decent, I had to prune, fertilize, and water with surgical precision. If I got lazy even for a weekend, they'd respond with legginess, browning, or worse, total collapse. For a while, I blamed myself. But then I realized I didn't start gardening to work harder. I started because I needed a place to rest, to feel joy and connection and quiet creativity. Petunias, for all their early season sparkle, became more like a high-maintenance house guest. They needed constant reassurance, and even then they couldn't always hold themselves together. Now I choose plants that work with the climate, not against it. Calabrachoa, with its hundreds of mini blooms, doesn't mind heat. It trails beautifully and stays full without constant trimming. Bacopa, with its understated grace, actually improves in hot weather. Even lantana, though bolder in color, gives me months of blooms without complaint. When you choose plants that align with your space and climate, the garden begins to care for you too. It took me too many years to understand this, but I share it now so you don't waste your time or your heart chasing the wrong flower. Let go of the guilt. Let go of the struggle. Sometimes it's not about trying harder. It's about choosing better. So here we are, dear friend, at the end of a long garden path, one paved with petals and mistakes, muddy knees, and hard-won wisdom. If you've made it this far, you know this wasn't really a list about 8 flowers. It was a love letter to learning. Every plant I've regretted planting taught me something far more lasting than blooms. Morning glories showed me how beauty can become overwhelming when left unchecked. Impatience taught me that not all things worth loving can survive without constant care, and that's okay. Zinnias reminded me that even strong flowers need space to breathe. Sunflowers. They taught me about balance and boundaries, about not growing taller than your roots can hold. Mint taught me that not every good thing belongs everywhere, no matter how sweet it smells. Dahlias whispered that spectacular can still be unsustainable. Nasturtiums revealed how a small misstep can echo loudly across a whole garden. And petunias, well, they broke my heart in the softest way. And yet I'm still here, still gardening, still smiling at the first sign of green in spring, still dreaming up container arrangements over tea and seed catalogs. Maybe more careful now, more patient, more attuned, but never less hopeful. That's the gift of gardening as we age. We don't just grow flowers anymore, we grow ourselves. And let me remind you of this in case you've forgotten lately, your hands still create beauty. Your care still matters. Even in the smallest of spaces, you're shaping something that brings joy, peace, and life. That is no small thing. If this video has helped you avoid even one regret, I hope you'll take a moment to share it. Maybe leave a comment below. Which flower in your own garden taught you the biggest lesson? I'd love to hear about it. And don't forget, next week I'm sharing the flowers that never failed me. The ones that bloom longer, ask less, and quietly improve with age, much like we do. So be sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you don't miss it. Until then, may your soil be forgiving, your flowers steady, and your heart full of the wisdom that only time can grow. Happy gardening, dear friend.